Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, it's good to hear that in different translations sometimes. It's always good to hear God's Word in different versions. This morning we are going to do what I was planning on doing last week, except that I was sick. We want to take some time and just update the congregation as to what is going on with Relearning, Relearning community. Hopefully all of you have heard those words, Relearning community, at some way or in various ways over the past year and a half or so. If you're still not 100% sure what that is, or if you're new around, Relearning community is a process that CMF has been in officially since about November of 2017. And it's in partnership with our wider church, Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, and an organization called 3DM Europe, which actually doesn't exist anymore. 3DM has changed its name to Catalyze Change. That's neither here nor there. Regardless, it's a ministry that helps churches to be transformed and to learn what it is like to make disciples. Because that's what Jesus told us to do. That's what we just read in the Great Commission there, that Jesus told us to go into all the world and make disciples of people. But how do we do that? If I were to give that instruction to you, to go and make a disciple, how would you do that? How does that make you feel if I tell you to do that and I expect that you're going to follow through and do that? What does it look like? Well, that's the point of Relearning community. And so I'm going to try and summarize the process so far, what we've been doing so far, some of the learnings that we've had, and I'm going to try and do it in a succinct way, because then Paul is going to come. He's going to share some of his personal reflections, how he's been impacted by that this week. So I'm going to try and summarize as much as possible, because I read this week that there's a fine line between a long sermon and a hostage situation. So we're going to try not to cross that line this morning. So Relearning community is a process where it's designed to help us to learn about what making disciples can look like for us, what it should look like for us, how it looks like naturally for us. And if you haven't heard too much about the process so far, and it's been about a year and a half we've been in this, not quite a year and a half, there's a reason that you haven't heard too much. And to do that, to explain why that is, I want to give you a bit of an illustration too. Imagine that across the house, or across from where you live, there's an empty lot across the road. And suddenly you see evidence that a house is going to be built there. Well, you're looking out your front door. You don't see very much initially, but then you see that they've been working away. They've dug a hole. And the first thing they do is pour a foundation down below, the footing. And that's what the whole structure is based on. That's really important to have a good solid footing for a house. But from looking out your front door, you don't see very much of it. All you see is the hole, and there's been some activity there. Well, next they will put up the concrete forms, and they'll pour the walls up to the level of the ground. And that's important too, but still, you're really not seeing very much out of your front door. But then the framers come along, and they put a floor on that foundation, and they start to put up the outside walls, the stud walls, and now you can see that something is really starting to take shape. It's starting to look like something. It's starting to look like a house. And then finally they put the roof on, and the shingles and the siding and the windows and all those finishing touches that eventually it starts to look like an actual house. You know that it is, and it's ready or close to being ready for a family to move in there. Well, I think that pretty accurately sums up where we've been at with the process so far. We've got some slides on PowerPoint here that I'm going to try and run through here. If we can put that up, please. So much of what we've been doing so far as a Relearning team has been under the surface. It's not been very easy to see. Before we started this process, we tried to explain what the process was in general terms, and we invited anyone from the congregation who wanted to be part of it or who was interested in it to be part of it. And as we put that invitation out, a number of people came forward, and we formed what we refer to as our Relearning team. And that Relearning team is Kim and myself, Paul and Dar, Jason and Donna Hurdle, and Travis is over there. I was trying to find you there for a second. So that's been our relearning team so far. So much of what we've been doing so far has just been kind of with this team. We started off with a retreat, and there's a series of 4 retreats over this 2-year process. The first, I'm going to try and get out of the way a little bit here. The first retreat was called Building a Discipling Culture. Now, the green line there, I want you to think of that as the ground level. That's kind of, in terms of a building, that's where ground level is. So this first retreat was underneath the ground level. And it starts off by helping us to understand that what we're doing is foundational stuff. Relearning Community isn't a new program. In fact, it's not a program, and it's not really new teaching even at all. It's actually old teaching. It's about rediscovering how Jesus made disciples. It's very Bible-based, it's very Jesus-based, and we look at how Jesus went about forming his group and how he encouraged them and made them into disciples and his followers. So it's not about adding programs or adding committees, it's about changing church culture. So that's what this first retreat was about building a discipling culture. What does it look like for a church to at its core, at its very culture, be one that is involved in disciple making? And not just running programs and hoping that disciples are going to be made, but that we're seeing through our lives, how we're living our lives and how we're just doing life together as church, that people are coming to discover Jesus through how we're living our lives. It's to help us discover what disciple making can look like in ways that are just normal and natural to us. It's just who we are. It's how we function. And that requires a change of culture. 6 months later, we had a second retreat. And I'll get out of the way on that one, try to a little bit, called Multiplying Missional Leaders. This is still below the ground level. You can see that's still underneath the ground, so there's still not a lot that the whole congregation is really seeing, but there's some foundational stuff that's been going on there. The retreat focused on how the church needs leaders. How the church needs leaders and ministers to do this work. And it focused really on how Jesus went about investing himself in the people around him. In particular, we see him doing this with the 12. At the core of it, it's something that we call a huddle. And that's not a word that Jesus used. That's a kind of a word that was made up for modern language, and we tend to know what huddle means. I mean, if I were to say, everybody, okay, you huddle together and discuss a certain topic, or if it's really cold in here, we huddle together for warmth. We know what huddle means, right? So or a football huddle. So that's the idea. It's a gathering together. And as Jesus went about in his ministry, we see that he had crowds of followers around him. In fact, sometimes those crowds of people were so big he couldn't even get into towns. The people were just so big around him. But out of those huge crowds, he chose people to come into a deeper relationship with him. In particular, he chose the 12. He went and invited those 12 to come and follow him. And he invested himself in those 12. And in some ways, that's what Jesus was doing. He was huddling. He was bringing those people together, and he was investing them. He was teaching them. He was challenging them. And really what he was doing was equipping them to be leaders that would take over the ministry that he was doing after he left. And so the huddle, what we call the huddle, is about building leaders, about building people who understand their call to ministry and their gifts to ministry and how to use those gifts. Relearning Community uses a number of shapes to help communicate ideas. And we've learned a number of different shapes. And you've maybe seen some of those, but the kind of the core shape that we use is one called a learning circle. And it's a shape that reminds us and shows us how Jesus taught people, how he invested in them. Ultimately, you see this line at the top. And that line symbolizes your life. But then something comes along, and you see that X there. That X is a situation in your life. Maybe it can be a positive incident. It could be a negative incident. It could be something that you've just been challenged by, a place that you're stuck, a place where you need growth. We call that a kairos time. And kairos is the Greek word for time, but not in the sense of chronological time, in the sense of opportunity, where Jesus says, now is the time. So as we have an incident that comes along, something happens in our lives, we look at that as an opportunity that God is inviting us into a deeper learning of something. Now we can ignore that and continue to go on and do our own thing, or we can accept God's invitation and go into that circle and begin to learn and understand what it is that God is wanting to teach us. And when we see Jesus doing this, we read the Gospels, we can see lots of different places where Jesus uses this kind of approach that we see here. There's an example that we see in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, 25 to 33, where Jesus is teaching about worrying. And so there's a temptation that comes, and Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount starts teaching the people about worry. So there's something that's happened. There's a kairos, there's an opportunity to learn, and so Jesus teaches about that. In verse 26, Jesus gives them something to observe. He says, "See the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them." So he just puts it out there. It's an observation. And look at the birds. There they are. They don't worry about where they're going to eat or any of those things. They just go on with life, trusting that everything is going to be all right. But then out of that, Jesus leads them into a deeper reflection on that truth. And he says, "Are you not much more valuable than they?" And he causes them to think about that. If God takes care of the birds, won't he take care of me too? And he invites them into a deeper reflection, understanding of that. Then in verses 27 and 28, Jesus says this. He asks them a question. He says, "Who of you can add a single hour to your life by worrying? And why do you worry about clothes?" It doesn't say it in the passage necessarily, but we know that the way rabbis taught in those days was really not this way at all. It wasn't one person up here talking and somebody else listening. It wasn't even a school kind of format where students are taking notes and just listening to one person talk. It was discussion-oriented. And so he asked them questions, and they would talk back and forth about this. And so when he asked this question, there would have been discussion. Who of you can add a single hour to your life? And so they would have had conversation around that. Ultimately, in this half of the circle, Jesus is bringing them to a place where they can begin to hear what God is saying to them. Out of this kairos, out of this opportunity to learn, he's helping them to figure out, okay, what is God saying to me about this situation? But it doesn't stop there. We need to act on that. And so he continues to lead them to the other side of the circle where we can begin to not only hear what God is saying, but plan to put it into action. And in verse 33, we see Jesus saying, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." So he leads them to hear God's voice and leads them into beginning to discern how they're going to act on that, how that's going to change their lives. And so that's been the focus in a lot of ways of what we've been doing up until now. Up until now, we've been focusing a fair bit on the huddle and people coming together and learning these things, learning these concepts, these ideas, and training leaders. But the point of this whole process isn't to create a whole bunch of huddles. That's really not the whole point. It's, again, as I said before, it's to change the culture of the church so that disciple making is something that we just do naturally by how we live out our faith. So then this past November, we had our third retreat that was on launching missional communities. Notice here now we've moved above the ground level. And so as a congregation, you're going to be seeing more and more of what's happening. And there's going to be opportunities for anyone in the congregation who wants to begin to participate more actively to do that. There will be opportunities that will come. In this retreat, we were talking about this thing that they call missional community, or another name for it is family on mission. When you go back and you read the New Testament, you read how the early church was formed, you'll often see a story about how there was a ministry happening and it says, and their whole household, this person and their whole household was saved. Or in some of Paul's letters and other letters, it says, give greetings to this person and the church that meets in their house. Well, that word for house or for household is the word oikos. Now, you probably thought that was a yogurt. It's actually not the Greek word for yogurt. It's the Greek word for household, which in a lot of ways, it doesn't necessarily mean even blood relatives. The way people lived in those days was they lived together in community. So they would have a family, parents, children, often grandparents. They would have people that worked for them, whether they called them servants or household workers, and other people that were part of their close-knit relationship. And that was household. And because that's how they lived, when they began to establish the early church, because it was the only way they really knew how to live, it was naturally the way they began to do church. And so as they worshiped together, and as they followed Jesus in this household kind of setting, that's very different in a lot of ways from what we define as family. We think of family as, there's lots of different definitions, but a traditional definition of family is mother, father, children. Or it can be a single-parent family, but there's children, and that's kind of it. We think of nuclear family. And that idea really wasn't one that was big to them. Family meant a lot more than that. And so they began to do church in that kind of family kind of context. So in our present-day culture, Relearning Community doesn't use this word oikos very much, but it uses the word missional community or family on mission instead. And so our goal and our next steps that we're moving towards is to start to begin to establish some of these missional communities or these families on mission. And the next number of months, we're going to be moving towards starting at least one of those. Again, the purpose of which is so that we can learn to live life together, live out our faith together, share our lives together, and then be inviting those people around us that are in our lives already who maybe don't know Jesus to share in that life. So that they will begin to see the joy and the hope and all the good things that we have received through relationship with God through Jesus. And they'll want that for themselves. Because that's the way the church grew in the early church. Just as they lived life, as they followed Jesus. And the people who were already naturally in their lives saw that. They wanted that for themselves. And so that's where we'll begin to move in the next number of months. There's another key shape that I just want to draw your attention to briefly. I forgot that part of the slide, but that's what household was. Another shape is this triangle. And the triangle reminds us of balance in our lives, but also in our church life, how we need to try and balance our lives and our missions between these three areas. The up part of the triangle reminds us of our relationship with God. It's the worship aspect of our relationship with God. The out aspects remind us of relationships with people outside of the church, people who don't yet know Jesus or aren't walking closely with him. And then the in relationship is about deepening love for each other, encouraging each other, walking together, supporting each other who are already in God's kingdom. The point of reminding us of this is that it's often easiest for us to do the up and do the in, and we can spend almost all our time and energy doing those things, worshiping and fellowshipping together and kind of becoming an inward-looking group, but neglect the out piece. And so the triangle reminds us that we need to try and have all three of those areas in our lives, but also in our church. And we want our triangle to look like an equilateral triangle like this. We don't want one of those weird ones that has a long side off to the thing where we're unbalanced. We want a balanced kind of triangle. In June of this year, we'll have our final retreat. And even though it's the final retreat of this 2-year process, it's not by any stretch the end of the process. And in a nutshell, the retreat will remind us that this ministry isn't about us. The whole point of this thing is not to build a really big Sunday school. It's not to put a whole bunch of new bums in seats. It's not about building a good, big, well-known, influential church at CMF here. The point is building the kingdom. The point is that we're seeing what God is doing. God is calling us to build his kingdom, and we just want to work alongside of him. And so we'll focus on that. Relearning community isn't something that will take over or replace necessarily anything that we're doing now, but it's something that will remind us and help us to think differently about what it means to live out our faith and what it means to be the church. And because culture doesn't change in just a few months, and it doesn't change even in 2 years, it takes many more years for us to really change our thinking, change our hearts, change the way that we live. It'll be an ongoing process. But that's the goal for us, to begin to think about how we live, how we live out our faith, how we do church in ways that where we're sharing our lives in a balanced way of worshiping, of fellowshipping together, but also reaching out and inviting other people into our lives so that they too can experience the hope and the good news that is Jesus. That's what God has called us to do. God's called us to go into all the world and make disciples. And that doesn't mean just far away. That means right here in our own town, right here in our own community of Drayton and Palmerston and Moorfield and Elmira and other places around us. So that's the process in a nutshell and some of the teachings. I'm going to invite Paul at this time to share some of his own reflections as well.
Yeah, so just leave that up there because it's kind of helpful for me to maybe share a little bit about the journey that I've been on through this process. So the first year and a half were really hard because grew up and been hardwired into you build a program in a church and people come, and that's why they come, and so it's all about what can we do to draw people in, and that's been a very hard thing to relearn through the Relearning community process. Is where do I influence people outside of the building more than just a program, and so every time we would get together and we do that line where you're doing life and then you see this Kairos moment, I'd always be challenged to think, well, what program could we do out of that? And it's taken a long time to get that unwired, and I'm still not there yet. So I wanted to share with you a few examples or at least one anyway, and maybe it'll turn into two, of where I think I'm starting to get it. So at the last retreat, we spent a lot of time talking about kingdom and covenant, which I think Pastor Craig will be spending some time doing some sermons on some of the things we've been working on. But I'm a very kingdom-driven person. What I mean by that is I understand very well this up-down authority thing, and that's the world I work in, right? So for me, it's about owner, workers, up-down respect. It's about authority. It's about understanding what your roles and responsibilities are in that. Yeah, I'm not so good at the covenant thing. And the covenant thing is, understanding when there's time to engage an employee who's having a difficult time in a meaningful conversation rather than always be so kingdom-focused. And the one challenge that I was faced with on that weekend was, what does that look like? So in the one I had shared, and we had another individual there who was leading the huddle, and he just said, Paul, you need more covenant in your life and less kingdom. Ha ha ha, But then at the end of the weekend, we saw what covenant looks like played out, and that was so the retreat was the week after we had shared about Sonia's friend from YWAM committing suicide. And we had shared that, and unplanned or unbeknownst to us, the whole group, not just our group, but everybody on the last Sunday morning worship had said, we'd really like to pray for your daughter. And that really touched us. And then, so at the end, it was like, okay, that's covenant lived out. So what would that look like for me? So I just prayed that, God, sometime this week you would show me a covenant opportunity. That took till 9 o'clock Monday morning. When I rolled into work and one of my key employees' father was admitted to hospital with an emergency and nobody knew what was going on in his body. And she was devastated. And so I had gone into her office, and she was just, she was a mess. The old Paul would have, pumped her up and promptly walked back out of the door and figured everything was going to be okay. And this time I decided, you know what, I'm going to ask her if I could pray with her. Well, I don't know if it made any difference. I think it did. I think she comes from a Christian home and her parents are strong Christians, but I don't think anybody's ever prayed with her before, certainly not at work. And so, two things. One, I didn't wish for that to happen to her so Paul could learn how to do covenant. But two, I was thankful that I didn't waver from the opportunity. I think God gives us all opportunities to do covenant and kingdom multiple times every day. And you can pray for God to give you opportunities, but if you then miss the opportunity or you don't see the Kairos moment, then I think that's the thing you got to reflect on at the end of the day and go, what did I miss today? Did I miss some of those chances? That employee of mine is never going to be a member of Community Mennonite Fellowship. But for me, what I always have been challenged by is, Jesus didn't spend a lot of time saving the saved. Okay? What I mean is, we come here to be support for each other and to re-energize ourselves to go. And I think the real challenge that's thrown in front of us is, what are you going to do for those that are lost out there? And I don't mean going halfway around the world, and that's meaningful too. But we all have influence. We all have opportunities to do covenant everywhere we go. Our immediate family, our workplace, people you meet in a social aspect, the arena, the sports field. The list goes on and on and on. And if you honestly ask God to show you a chance to do covenant, He will put people in your way. Literally in your way. Where you'll have to intentionally go around them to not do covenant. They will be that obvious. So my challenge to you is, as we ask you to be a part of this and see those opportunities, that's what I think is going to continue to build this family of faith here, and it'll really, really help the world, which is what Jesus really wanted us to do, be world changers. That's all I got.
Thanks, Paul. And I think any other of the members of that team could have shared something as well. We can share their experience if you still have questions or still are curious about what God is doing. So in the next number of weeks, we're going to continue to look at some things that relate into Relearning Community, in particular, looking at the giftings and the callings that God has given to us, and have opportunities to discover, if you haven't already, what your gifts and what your calling is, and begin to understand those and to live into them. The other thing I'll say is don't get thrown off by some of the lingo, the huddle and kairos and the triangle. All these things are really just designed to help us to understand ideas and to build a bit of a language. We're at a point now with our huddle group that if I talk about the triangle, I don't have to explain it the way I did just now. They know what the triangle is. And some of the other shapes as well. And so these are just things that help us to understand better, and we'll grow together in those sorts of things too. But if you have more questions, I hope some questions have been answered, but others can be answered just in conversations with those who are in the group. And like I said, as we move forward in this, there'll be more opportunities for you to participate if you wish to. There'll be no pressure to do that, but if you want to have opportunities to connect in more, you'll definitely have those chances. So let's pray, and then I'll invite Paul to come and lead us in a closing song. Jesus, thank you for the opportunities that you give to us to learn. You are inviting us to grow. You are inviting us into these places where we can understand you better, we can understand ourselves better, and we can just grow as followers of you. God, help us to see those opportunities and not to walk past them, not to ignore them, but to accept your invitation to come in and to learn and to grow and to invite other people into our lives so that they can see us, so they can see what following Jesus looks like when things are good, so they can see what following Jesus looks like when we mess up, when we make mistakes, when we get mad at our kids or mad at our spouse, and they can still see what following Jesus looks like when we have to ask for forgiveness, when we're imperfect. And God, give us opportunities to be able to share the hope that we have in the good news of Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.